She was not supposed to be there. Not in that house, not in that kitchen, not wearing a gray dress with her hair pinned flat under a linen cap. Genevieve Hartwell had been born in Ashmore Hall. She had taken her first steps in the East Parlor, learned to read in the library on the second floor, and once, when she was 9 years old, fallen asleep in the garden under the oak that still stood near the stone wall. That oak was the only thing left that remembered her. The rest of the house had forgotten entirely. She had been told, when she arrived at the servants' entrance 3 weeks ago, that the housekeeper position had already been filled. But the cook's assistant had left that morning without notice, and Mrs. Hartley, the real housekeeper, a woman of thin lips and efficient movements, had looked Genevieve up and down the way one examines a bolt of cloth before cutting it. "You've worked in a house before?" "Yes, ma'am." "References?" Genevieve had produced a letter. It was not forged, exactly. She had written it herself, in the hand of a woman who had once employed her cousin in Derbyshire, and who had died the previous autumn. The dead are difficult to contradict. "You'll start in the scullery. 3 shillings a week, and your meals." That was how Genevieve Hartwell, the only surviving daughter of the late Baron Hartwell of Ashmore, came to scrub the floors of her own inheritance. She did not think of it that way, most of the time. Thinking of it that way made her hands shake, and she could not afford shaking hands. There were dishes to carry, there was silver to polish. There was the matter of the linen count on Thursday mornings, and the ash in the fireplaces on cold nights, and the endless, bottomless work of keeping a great house breathing. The Duke of Ashmore had not yet arrived. He was expected before the end of the month. That was all anyone seemed to know, or at least all anyone seemed willing to say in the kitchen. His Grace had been abroad for 2 years. Something to do with his estates in the north of France, though Mrs. Hartley was not the sort of woman to explain things to the lower staff. Genevieve gathered what she could from fragments. A word here from the footman, a sentence from the parlor maid. The house was being readied for him the way one readies a stage. Everything polished, everything positioned, everything prepared for an audience of one. Genevieve listened and said nothing. She had become very good at saying nothing. It had not always been that way. 2 years ago she had said quite a lot, actually. She had gone to London with letters from her father's solicitor, and evidence, careful, documented, entirely legal evidence, that the deed transferring Ashmore Hall to the Duke of Ashmore's family had been executed while her father was ill and unable to understand what he was signing. She had sat in 3 separate offices and explained this to 3 separate men in good coats who had listened with the particular patience of men who have already decided not to help. The law was what the law was, they said. Her father had signed. She had no standing. She had gone home to a rented room in the village, home only by proximity, and sat on the edge of a narrow bed and thought for a long time about what she had left. She had the letters. She had her father's journal, which mentioned the illness and the solicitor's visit in the same week. She had a memory of a house, and the smell of it in autumn when the windows were opened after summer, and the specific quality of light in the library at 4 in the afternoon. What she needed was access. What she needed was to get inside. The cook, whose name was Mrs. Oates, and who had the sort of comfortable authority that only comes from feeding people well for 30 years, took a liking to Genevieve early on. She called her Ginny, which no one had ever called her before, and taught her the Duke's preferences with the seriousness of someone passing on a sacred text. No fennel. He can't abide fennel since he came back from France. Don't ask me why. I've not asked, and I'll not ask. Cold beef on Sunday nights if there's been a formal dinner Saturday. He doesn't want another heavy meal. And he takes his tea plain, no sugar, no milk, plain as rainwater. You remember that? Genevieve remembered that. She remembered everything. The library on the second floor was locked. She had tested it on her third day, walking past in the particular unhurried way she had learned. Not too quickly, because quick movement draws the eye. Not too slowly, because slow movement draws suspicion. She had tried the handle as though she were simply checking whether it needed attention. It was locked. The solicitor's documents she needed were, almost certainly, in the library. Her father had kept everything in the library. 30 years of correspondence, estate records, going back 2 centuries, the private journals he had maintained since before her birth. If there was anything that could prove the deed had been signed under duress, the physician's letter that her father had mentioned in his own journal, the note from the solicitor about the timing of the visit, it would be in that room. She just needed to get in. She had been thinking about this problem from several angles when the Duke of Ashmore arrived, 12 days early, on a Tuesday morning when the house was not ready, and Mrs. Hartley was in a state of controlled emergency that expressed itself as an extremely clipped walk and a series of very short sentences. Genevieve was carrying a tray of polished candlesticks down the main corridor when she heard the wheels on the drive. She stepped to the side, as the parlor-maid had once instructed her. Staff did not linger in corridors when His Grace was entering the house. She turned to go back toward the servants' hall and found she had miscalculated. The corridor branched here, and she had turned the wrong way, and now the front door was opening and she was 10 feet from it with a tray of candlesticks, and no graceful method of retreat. She looked at the floor. She heard boots on the marble. She heard a voice say something low and brief to the footman. She heard the door close. Then there was a pause. "You're new," said a voice. It was not a question. She looked up. She had intended to look up only far enough to be polite, eyes at chin level, the proper distance. But she looked further than she meant to, and found herself looking at a face that was watching her with an attention she had not expected. The Duke of Ashmore was younger than she had imagined. She had imagined someone like her father's contemporaries, heavy, gray, certain of their own importance. He was perhaps 35, lean in the way that comes not from youth but from constant movement, with dark hair that wanted cutting and eyes, the color of the oak tree in the garden in October. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been traveling for a long time and had forgotten to decide whether he was glad to have arrived. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. 3 weeks, Your Grace." He looked at the candlesticks. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. "Carry on," he said, and walked past. She carried on. That evening, in the kitchen, Mrs. Oates told her that His Grace had asked for his supper in the study rather than the dining room, and that he had already sent word to the solicitor in the village. Genevieve set down the pot she was washing. "Is that usual?" she asked, carefully. "For him?" Mrs. Oates considered. "He's particular about his papers, always has been, even before he went abroad. Likes to know the state of things." She paused. "Of course, there's all that business from the old baron. He'll want to have a look at all of that, I expect." Genevieve picked up the pot again. "Of course," she said. She thought about the library for the rest of the night. In the days that followed, she developed a sense of where he was at any given moment, not through any design, but because a large house with few inhabitants has its own acoustics, and she was in the habit now of listening. She knew when he came down early for coffee. She knew when he walked the grounds in the late afternoon, following the same path along the stone wall, stopping sometimes near the oak tree. She knew when he worked late in the study because the light came under the door and stayed there past midnight. She also knew, by the end of the first week, that he had not opened the library. She could not determine why. The key was on Mrs. Hartley's ring. The library was catalogued, maintained, undisturbed. It was simply not visited. She wondered, once, whether he knew what was in there, whether he had ever looked at those 30 years of her father's correspondence and recognized what it represented. Not just records, but a life. Her father's life. The life of the family that had built that house and planted that oak and loved that library before he had ever seen any of it. She thought about this the way she thought about most things that frightened her, practically, from a distance, with her hands doing something else. On a Wednesday evening in the third week of October, she found him in the garden. She had not been expecting it. She had come to check the kitchen garden for the last of the rosemary before the cold properly set in, and there he was, standing near the oak tree, not doing anything in particular, just standing, the way people stand when they are somewhere they do not know how to be. She could have turned back. She should have turned back, said before she could stop herself. The bark has grown over an old scar. On the lower left side. He turned. He looked at her. I beg your pardon. She had committed to it now, the oak tree. When I was, she stopped. I've heard it was damaged. Lightning, years ago. You can still see where it healed. She had been 8 years old. The lightning had struck on a summer night, and her father had come into her room because the sound had woken her, and the next morning they had gone outside. Outside together, and he had shown her the mark on the tree, and told her that living things are built to survive what would seem to destroy them. She had not thought of that in 2 years. She thought of it now with the particular clarity of something that has been waiting in a box. The Duke of Ashmore walked to the tree. He looked at the bark where she had indicated. He placed his hand over the healed scar in a way that was neither dramatic nor self-conscious. Simply curious. Simply present. You're observant, he said. For someone who's been here 3 weeks. I pay attention, Your Grace. He was looking at the tree. My father purchased this estate when I was 17. I never felt it was mine particularly. He paused. I don't know why I'm telling you that. She said nothing. She had learned the particular value of nothing. There was a family, he said. Before, a Baron, Hartwell. He died shortly after the sale. He took his hand from the tree. Do you know anything about that? Her heart was a careful, quiet thing. She had been practicing this for 2 years. Only what one hears, Your Grace, she said. He nodded slowly, as though he had not entirely believed her and had not entirely not believed her either. Then he went inside, and she stood in the garden with the last of the rosemary in her hands and breathed until her hands were steady. The following morning, she found the library unlocked. She could not know whether this was connected to anything. Perhaps it had simply been unlocked for cleaning. Perhaps Mrs. Hartley had needed to take the inventory. She stood in the corridor for a moment, watching the open door from 10 feet away, and then she walked toward it with the expression of someone attending to ordinary duties. The library was exactly as she remembered. That was the thing she had not prepared for. She had expected changes, books moved, shelves rearranged, the general disorder of new ownership, but it was the same. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls. The desk sat in the same position near the tall windows. The light, at this hour, fell exactly as it had when she was a child doing her reading in the chair by the window, her father working at the desk while she pretended not to be watching him. She moved directly to the lower cabinet on the east wall. Her father had kept his physician's correspondence in the lower cabinet on the east wall. She had watched him file it there herself, once, when she had come in to ask him something, and he had been distracted and had not realized she was paying attention. She had been 12 years old. She had not known then. The cabinet was not locked. The cabinet was not locked. She opened it. The files were still there, her father's handwriting on the tabs. 30 years of correspondence organized by year, by category, by name. She found the physician's file without difficulty, Dr. Calloway, 1881 to 1889, and opened it, and there was the letter she had been looking for 2 years, dated October 14, 1887, describing her father's condition in the weeks preceding the signing of the deed. cognitive deterioration, susceptibility to suggestion, a strong recommendation against any significant legal decisions until recovery. The deed was signed October 19, 1887. 5 days later, she stood in her father's library in her gray servant's dress with the letter in her hand and did not cry, because she had made a decision 2 years ago not to cry about this until it was over, and it was not over yet. She was carefully returning the file to its position when she became aware that she was not alone. He was standing in the doorway. She did not know how long he had been there. She knew from the expression on his face that it had been long enough. There was a silence of the particular kind that has weight. "The rosemary," he said, finally. "You didn't need rosemary from the kitchen garden." "The scullery. There's a bunch of it hanging in the scullery. It's been there since August." She said nothing. "You knew where the cabinet was," he said, "without looking for it." She had thought occasionally about this moment. She had imagined several versions of it. In most of them she said something composed and strategic. In most of them she had more control than she currently seemed to have. "My name is Genevieve Hartwell," she said. The silence changed its quality. "Hartwell," he said. "The Baron was my father. This was my house." She kept her voice level. "I am not here to take anything. I have no legal recourse. I've been told that quite clearly by 3 separate solicitors. I only wanted—" She stopped. She set the physician's letter on the desk between them. "I wanted to know if this existed. I needed to know if my father knew what he was signing." He came into the room. He did not come quickly. He walked to the desk and looked at the letter, but he did not pick it up. "The deed was signed in October of 1887, he said. "Yes, my father negotiated that deed." He was quiet for a moment. "He died 4 years ago. I inherited this estate along with the others." He picked up the letter. He read it. He set it down. "I knew my father had acquired Ashmore quickly. I did not know the circumstances." She waited. "Why didn't you come to me?" he asked. "When you found you had no legal recourse, why not come directly to the family? Would you have seen me?" He looked at her. She looked back. "I don't know," he said honestly. The honesty of it surprised her. She had expected defense. She had expected the particular armor that people construct around inherited privilege, the way they learn to not see what is uncomfortable to see. She had not expected a man who would stand in her father's library and say, "I don't know," with the full weight of meaning it carried. "The letter is yours," he said. "Whatever you choose to do with it. It changes nothing legally, no." He was looking at the physician's letter again. "But it changes something." She did not ask him what he meant. She thought she knew. Some things are not about the law. Some things are about whether you can look at the record of what happened and call it by its right name. That was what she had come for, in the end. Not the house back, not the land, not the oak tree that had belonged to her family for 4 generations. She had come for the truth of it. She had come to know that her father had not simply let it go. He had not let it go. He had been taken from. These were different things. She picked up the letter. She folded it and placed it in the pocket of her gray dress. "You should know," he said, as she was moving toward the door, "that I've been trying to reach you." She stopped. "I employed a solicitor of my own 6 months ago to find the Hartwell heir." He was not looking at her now. He was looking at the shelves, at all those years of her father's files. "I thought there should be some arrangement, some acknowledgement." He paused. "He couldn't find you. You weren't where you were supposed to be." "No," she said. "I was here." He turned at that. She did not stay to see his full expression. She had enough. She had what she had come for, and she had, unexpectedly, entirely without planning it, something additional that she could not yet name. The certainty, perhaps, that the man who now held Ashmore Hall was not her father's enemy, was not indifferent, was standing in a library he had never quite believed was his, reaching for the same truth she had been reaching for, only from the other side of it. In the weeks that followed, she stopped pretending. She did not pretend to have a reference letter. She did not pretend to need access to the library. She did not carry trays past rooms she was trying to observe, or listen at corridors with the careful patience of someone planning. She was still at Ashmore Hall. Mrs. Hartley, to her considerable confusion, had been instructed by His Grace that Miss Hartwell was to be treated as a guest, but she was no longer in gray. She sat in the library at 4 in the afternoon, when the light came in the way she remembered. He came to find her there more often than not. They talked about the estate, about what it had been, what it was, what could be done. He listened to her the way he had listened in the garden, with the particular attention of someone who is genuinely interested in what comes next. He told her about France, about his father, about the feeling of inheriting a life that had already been fully lived by someone else. She told him about London, about the 3 solicitors, about the evening she had sat on the narrow bed and decided to come back. He did not offer to return the house. The law remained what the law was, but he asked her, one afternoon in November when the oak tree had lost its last leaves and the garden was silver with early frost, whether she would be willing to remain. Not as a guest, he said, not as an employee. He said it without decoration, the way he said most things, plainly, with his eyes on her face, and nothing performed about it. He said he had inherited a house he did not know, and she knew it better than anyone living. He said he had been looking at her father's library for weeks now, and thought that perhaps it needed someone who understood what was in it. He said he was aware this was not a simple thing to ask, and that he was asking it anyway. She looked out the window at the garden, at the stone wall, at the oak tree, bare now, the healed scar on its lower left side, visible from this distance if you knew where to look. She had come back to Ashmore to find something. She had found it. The letter, the truth, the proof of what she had always known. She had thought when she found it, that would be enough. She had not planned for what came after. What came after, she was learning, was not always something you could plan for. She was standing at the window when she realized she was not looking at the tree. She was looking at the reflection in the glass, his reflection, behind her, watching her with the patience of someone who has waited for things before and has learned the particular discipline of it. She recognized that. She had practiced it herself. I would need access to the library, she said. Yes. And the estate records. Yes. And you would need to tell Mrs. Hartley. I've already told Mrs. Hartley. She turned from the window. He was standing close enough that she could see. He was, very slightly, nervous, the way people are when they have said something that cannot be unsaid and are not sorry for it. The way people are when the truth of a thing has become visible and they have decided to look directly at it rather than away. My father, she said, would have liked you. He was quiet for a moment. Would he? He liked people who told him the truth. She paused, even when it was difficult. The light in the library was the afternoon light she had grown up with. The shelves held her father's decades. The oak tree outside had survived a lightning strike and kept growing, which was the sort of thing her father had always said was worth noticing. She thought about narrow beds in rented rooms. She thought about gray dresses and reference letters and the specific loneliness of being in a place that does not know your name. She thought about what it meant to be known. Yes, she said. He did not ask what she meant. That was the thing about him she had found. He understood which silences were answers. On an afternoon in December, the solicitor came to the house with papers. Not papers about the old deed or the baron's estate or any of the complicated, unresolvable history of Ashmore Hall. Different papers. Papers about the future, which is a different country entirely, with different laws and different possibilities and significantly less to mourn. Genevieve Hartwell sat at the desk in the library. Her father's desk, the one she had watched him work at for 20 years, and signed her name in her own hand, without disguise, without a borrowed identity, without the particular careful grief of pretending to be someone she was not. The Duke of Ashmore signed beside her. Outside, the oak tree stood in the December light, the scar on its lower left side silver and healed and entirely visible, the way things are when enough time has passed and enough truth has been spoken, and the living, as they always do, keep growing.